10,000 years ago, the galaxy burned. Not from Xenos invasion or natural disaster, but from something far more terrible. Humanity's greatest son, raised by the Emperor himself, turned his weapons upon his father and plunged the stars into civil war. The Horus Heresy stands as the single most catastrophic event in human history, a conflict so devastating that its echoes still thunder through the grim darkness of the far future. Before the Imperium became a rotting corpse worshipping a dead god, before Space Marines became warrior monks chanting litanies of hate, before the galaxy knew only war, there was hope. The Great Crusade had lasted 2 centuries, uniting humanity under the golden banner of the Emperor's vision. 1,000,000 worlds had been brought into compliance. 18 genetically perfect Primarchs led their Space Marine legions across the stars, each one a demigod of war shaped by the Emperor's own hands. Among these titans of legend, one stood supreme, Horus Lupercal, the Warmaster, beloved above all others by the Emperor himself. Where other Primarchs excelled in singular aspects of war, Horus mastered them all. Tactical genius, charismatic leader, diplomatic negotiator, and peerless warrior, the Emperor trusted him with the fate of the galaxy itself, naming him Warmaster over all Imperial forces while the Master of Mankind withdrew to Terra for mysterious works. The archaeological evidence of what came next reads like a madman's fever dream. Fragmentary records speak of Space Marines turning their bolters on their own battle brothers, entire worlds burning as virus bombs scoured away all life, titans walking through the ruins of cities that had stood for millennia, the very fabric of reality tearing open as daemons poured forth from the warp to feast on the souls of the dying. But these are just the shadows cast by a far greater horror. The true nightmare of the Horus Heresy lies not in the scale of destruction. Though worlds beyond counting were reduced to ash, it lies not in the technological marvels lost forever, though humanity's golden age died screaming in the flames. The true horror lies in the fact that this catastrophe was not inflicted by alien invaders or natural disaster, but by humanity's own chosen champion. How does a son turn against his father? How does a hero become the architect of genocide? How does the galaxy's greatest hope transform into its ultimate nightmare? The answer lies buried in the deepest archives of the Imperium, guarded by the Inquisition, and spoken of only in whispers by those who dare to seek the truth. In the time before the heresy, the Imperium knew no gods. The Emperor's imperial truth had banished superstition and replaced it with reason and science. Humanity had conquered the stars through strength and intellect, not prayer and ritual. The warp was understood as a parallel dimension useful for faster-than-light travel, nothing more. The idea that vast intelligences might dwell in that realm, beings of such malevolent power that they could corrupt even a Primarch, was dismissed as primitive nonsense. Yet the evidence is undeniable. Something reached out from the Sea of Souls and touched the mind of Horus Lupercal, something that offered him power beyond imagination, knowledge beyond mortal comprehension, and the strength to remake the galaxy according to his will. The same force that had whispered to shamans and cultists throughout human history had found its greatest prize in the Emperor's most beloved son. The Chaos Gods had been patient. For millennia, they had watched as humanity spread across the galaxy, their psychic emanations growing stronger with each passing generation. They had seen the Emperor's great work, the Webway project that would free humanity from dependence on warp travel and starve the dark gods of the psychic energy they craved. They had witnessed the creation of the Primarchs, 20 genetically perfect beings whose souls blazed like beacons in the Imperium, and they had planned. The corruption of Horus was not a moment of weakness or a single act of betrayal. It was the culmination of a conspiracy that had been building since the very beginning of the Great Crusade. Every victory had been anticipated. Every triumph had been accounted for. Every moment of glory had been carefully orchestrated to bring the Warmaster to exactly the right place at exactly the right time. On the world of Davin, in the depths of a corrupt temple dedicated to powers that officially did not exist, the fate of the galaxy would be decided. The Emperor's greatest creation would be offered a choice that would damn or save humanity forever. The moment when hope would die, and the grim darkness of the far future would truly begin. But that moment of ultimate betrayal, that single decision that would condemn trillions to suffering and death, that transformation of beloved son into ultimate enemy, was merely the first domino to fall in a chain reaction that would shake the foundations of reality itself. The Horus Heresy was not just a civil war between Space Marine legions. It was the opening move in a cosmic game whose stakes encompassed the very soul of humanity. The records speak of 7 years of warfare that followed Horus's fall to chaos. 7 years during which brother fought brother, father fought son, and the galaxy itself became a battlefield between the forces of order and the primordial powers of the warp. 7 years that saw the Emperor's dream of human unity shattered beyond repair and replaced with an eternal nightmare of suspicion, hatred, and endless war. Yet even now, 10 millennia later, the true scope of what was lost during those 7 years remains hidden. The Imperium of the 41st millennium is but a shadow of what it once was, a decaying remnant of a golden age that most citizens cannot even imagine. The Space Marines, who once conquered the galaxy in the name of human progress, now serve as warrior monks, their minds filled with religious doctrine rather than scientific knowledge. The Emperor himself, once a figure of hope and enlightenment, has become a corpse god sustained by the daily sacrifice of 1,000 psychers. This is the legacy of the Horus Heresy, not just death and destruction, but the transformation of humanity's greatest dream into its darkest nightmare. The story of how the galaxy's most perfect warrior became its ultimate monster, and how the seeds of that corruption were planted in the very heart of the Imperium from the moment of its birth. For in the grim darkness of the far future, the greatest enemies come not from the void between stars, but from within the human heart itself. And the betrayal that began with a single son's corruption continues to echo through the ages, a wound that can never heal, a sin that can never be forgiven, and a warning that even the mightiest can fall to powers beyond mortal comprehension. The Horus Heresy was not just the end of humanity's golden age, it was the beginning of something far worse, a glimpse into the true nature of the universe itself, where even gods can bleed and heroes can become the very evil they once fought against. This is the story of how the galaxy learned to fear its own champions, and why, even 10,000 years later, the Imperium still trembles at the mention of a single name. Horus. The galaxy of the early 31st millennium bore little resemblance to the nightmare it would become. When the Great Crusade began in 798-Men30, humanity emerged from the ashes of the Age of Strife into a universe that seemed almost welcoming by comparison. The warp storms that had isolated human worlds for 5,000 years were finally beginning to subside, allowing for the first time in millennia the possibility of large-scale interstellar travel and communication. This was the cosmic environment that would birth both humanity's greatest triumph and its ultimate tragedy. The Emperor had spent the long centuries of the Age of Strife preparing for this moment, when the barriers between worlds would weaken enough to allow his grand vision to unfold. On Terra, in the deepest laboratories beneath the Himalayan peaks, genetic templates of unimaginable complexity had been crafted. The Primarch project represented the culmination of tens of thousands of years of accumulated knowledge about human biology, psychology, and the fundamental forces that shape reality itself. Yet even as the Emperor labored to create his perfect sons, forces beyond the material realm were stirring. The Chaos Gods, those vast intelligences that dwelt in the Sea of Souls, had been feeding on human emotion and psychic energy throughout the species' expansion across the galaxy. Every act of violence, every moment of despair, every surge of ambition or hatred had strengthened them incrementally. Now, as humanity prepared to unite under a single banner, these primordial powers sensed both opportunity and threat. The early manifestations of what would later consume the galaxy were subtle, almost imperceptible to those who lived through them. Astropaths reported increasing difficulty in maintaining clear communication across vast distances. Navigators spoke of strange currents in the warp that seemed to flow against the natural tides of the immaterium. Psychers across human space began experiencing dreams of impossible geometries and whispering voices that spoke in languages that predated human civilization. But these were merely the first tremors of a cosmic earthquake that would reshape the galaxy. The Emperor's grand design required not just the reunification of humanity, but the elevation of the species to a new level of existence. The Webway project, hidden even from his closest advisors, represented nothing less than humanity's liberation from dependence on the warp for interstellar travel. If successful, it would starve the chaos gods of the psychic energy they required to maintain their presence in the material universe. The irony was that the very success of the Great Crusade was accelerating humanity toward a psychic awakening that would make the species increasingly vulnerable to chaos corruption. Every world brought into compliance added millions of potential psychers to the human gene pool. Every victory celebration generated emotional resonances that echoed through the warp. Every act of conquest fed the darker aspects of human nature that the Chaos Gods found so nourishing. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals a pattern that would only become clear in hindsight. Compliance reports from the earliest stages of the Great Crusade mention recurring incidents of unexplained phenomena. Entire populations would sometimes experience shared nightmares. Ancient ruins would be discovered that seemed to predate human colonization by millions of years, covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly. Imperial forces would occasionally encounter resistance movements that displayed knowledge of tactics and technologies that should have been impossible for isolated human colonies to possess. The growing signs of what was to come were there for those who knew how to look. The Emperor certainly understood the nature of the threat, though he chose to shield his sons from the full truth. He had walked among humanity for millennia, watching the slow development of psychic abilities within the species. He had seen firsthand what happened to civilizations that allowed unrestricted contact with the warp. The fall of the Eldar Empire, the demonic incursions of the Dark Age of technology, the countless human worlds that had been consumed by chaos during the Age of Strife, all served as warnings of what awaited any species that grew too powerful in the psychic realm without proper safeguards. Statistical analysis of Great Crusade records reveals a troubling pattern of escalation. In the early decades, incidents of what Imperial authorities classified as warp-related phenomena occurred at a rate of approximately 1 per 1,000 compliance actions. By the time Horus was elevated to Warmaster, that rate had increased to nearly 1 in 50. The frequency of such incidents was growing exponentially. Yet the official Imperial response remained focused on conventional military solutions. This was the fundamental flaw in the Emperor's grand design. The Imperial truth, which declared that there were no gods, and that the warp was merely a tool to be used by humanity, was itself a form of blindness. By denying the spiritual reality of the universe, the Imperium had left itself vulnerable to forces that operated according to entirely different principles. The Chaos Gods did not need to be believed in to exist. They fed on emotion and psychic energy regardless of whether their existence was acknowledged or denied. The environmental conditions of the early 31st millennium were thus perfectly suited to the corruption that would follow. Humanity was more psychically active than it had been in millennia, yet officially denied the existence of the very forces that sought to exploit that activity. The Emperor's sons, the Primarchs, were the most psychically powerful humans ever created, yet they had been told nothing of the true nature of the powers that dwelt in the warp. The Space Marine legions were spreading across the galaxy at an unprecedented rate, yet they carried within their ranks the seeds of their own destruction. The cosmic conditions that enabled the Horus Heresy were not accidental. They were the inevitable result of humanity's rapid expansion, combined with the Emperor's decision to hide the true nature of reality from his own forces. The Chaos Gods had been patient, allowing the Great Crusade to succeed precisely because each victory brought humanity closer to the precipice from which there could be no return. As the 31st millennium progressed, the signs became increasingly difficult to ignore. Entire systems would sometimes go dark for months at a time, their astropathic communications cut off by warp storms that seemed to appear from nowhere. Expeditionary fleets would emerge from the warp to find their target worlds already in compliance, with no record of who had conquered them or how. Most disturbing of all, some Space Marine legions began reporting casualties from enemies that left no bodies, weapons that caused wounds that refused to heal, and battlefields where the very air seemed to whisper promises of power to those who listened. The primordial conditions were set. The stage was prepared. All that remained was for the principal actors to take their places in the cosmic drama that would determine the fate of humanity forever. The transformation of Horus Lupercal from loyal son to galaxy's greatest threat did not happen overnight. It was a gradual process, a slow erosion of certainty that began with the very qualities that made him the Emperor's chosen heir. His tactical genius, his charismatic leadership, his deep love for his father and his brothers. These were not flaws to be exploited but strengths to be corrupted. The Chaos Gods understood that the greatest heroes made the most effective villains, and they had chosen their target with infinite care. The gradual development of Horus's legendary status began almost from the moment of his rediscovery on Chthoniya. Unlike some of his brothers who had been raised in paradise or luxury, Horus had grown up in the gang wars of a mining world, learning from childhood that survival required not just strength but the ability to inspire loyalty in others. When the Emperor found him, Horus was already a king in all but name, ruling through a combination of personal charisma and tactical brilliance that would serve him well in the centuries to come. The early years of the Great Crusade saw Horus's influence expand far beyond his own legion. The Luna Wolves, as they were then known, became renowned not just for their battlefield prowess, but for their ability to integrate forces from other legions into cohesive fighting units. Horus possessed an almost supernatural ability to understand the motivations and capabilities of others, whether they were his fellow Primarchs or the baseline humans who served in the Imperial army. This talent made him invaluable as a coordinator and strategist, but it also made him acutely aware of the growing tensions within the Imperium. Key breakthrough moments in the Great Crusade's expansion often centered around Horus's ability to achieve what others could not: the compliance of the Interrex, a human civilization that had successfully coexisted with alien species for centuries, required not just military might, but diplomatic finesse. Horus alone among the Primarchs possessed the combination of intellectual curiosity and tactical awareness necessary to understand what the Interrex represented. Their warnings about the dangers of chaos fell on fertile ground precisely because Horus was intelligent enough to recognize truth when he heard it. The expanding influence of the Warmaster became particularly evident during the Ullanor campaign. The Orc Empire that had grown in the Galactic East represented the largest threat to human expansion since the beginning of the Great Crusade. The campaign to destroy it required the coordination of multiple Space Marine legions, hundreds of Imperial Army regiments, and the most sophisticated logistical operation in human history. The fact that Horus was able to not only plan and execute this campaign, but to do so while maintaining the loyalty and cooperation of his notoriously independent brothers, was a testament to his unique abilities. Growing recognition of Horus's tactical genius and charismatic leadership came not just from his victories, but from the manner in which he achieved them. Where other Primarchs might solve problems through overwhelming force or brilliant individual action, Horus excelled at creating solutions that maximized the strengths of everyone under his command. His battle plans were works of art that turned the diverse capabilities of the Space Marine legions into a weapon of unprecedented effectiveness. The Emperor's decision to name Horus as Warmaster after the Ullanor triumph was not simply a recognition of his military achievements. It was an acknowledgement that among all his sons, Horus alone possessed the combination of abilities necessary to lead the final phase of the Great Crusade. The Emperor's withdrawal to Terra for the Webway project was not abandonment but trust, a father's confidence that his most beloved son could carry on the work of uniting humanity without direct supervision. Yet this trust, this very love that the Emperor bore for his son, became the foundation for the corruption that would follow. Horus was not just a military commander, but a philosopher, a thinker who questioned the nature of the universe and humanity's place within it. His conversations with his fellow Primarchs often centered on the deeper meaning of their crusade, the ultimate goal toward which all their efforts were directed. When the Emperor withdrew to Terra without explanation, Horus found himself bearing not just the burden of military command, but the weight of representing the Emperor's vision to the galaxy. The expanding autonomy given to the Primarchs during this period was both necessary and dangerous. The scale of the Great Crusade had grown beyond what could be effectively micromanaged from a single location, even by the Emperor himself. Each Primarch was given increasing freedom to interpret the imperial truth and implement compliance procedures according to their own understanding. For most, this worked well. For Horus, who had always been the most thoughtful and questioning of his brothers, it created an opportunity for doubt to take root. The first subtle signs of resentment among some legions began to appear during this period, though they were not directed at Horus personally. The Space Marine legions had been created for conquest, not governance. As the Great Crusade neared completion, questions began to arise about what role the Astartes would play in the peaceful galaxy that was supposedly their ultimate goal. Some legions, particularly those led by more warlike Primarchs, began to chafe at the prospect of administrative duties and garrison assignments. Horus, more than any of his brothers, understood the implications of these concerns. His philosophical conversations with other Primarchs, often touched on the nature of their purpose and the question of what would happen when there were no more worlds to conquer. The Emperor's vision of a rational secular galaxy ruled by enlightened human reason was inspiring, but it left little room for the warriors who had made it possible. This awareness of the temporary nature of their glory began to weigh on Horus's mind, creating the first cracks in his absolute faith in his father's plan. The growing complexity of governing a galaxy-spanning empire presented challenges that pure military genius could not solve. Horus found himself dealing with questions of resource allocation, population management, and the integration of wildly diverse human cultures into a single imperial system. These were problems that required not just intelligence but wisdom, and they forced him to confront the limitations of the imperial truth as a governing philosophy. The burden of representing the Emperor's vision to the galaxy became increasingly heavy, as that vision itself began to seem less clear. The Emperor's withdrawal to Terra had been explained as necessary for a great work that would benefit all humanity, but the specifics remained hidden even from his most trusted son. This secrecy, which the Emperor justified as necessary for the success of the Webway project, began to erode the absolute trust that had always existed between father and son. As Horus's influence continued to spread, he began to attract the attention of those who had their own reasons for questioning the imperial status quo. The warrior lodges that had formed within some legions found in the Warmaster a sympathetic ear for their concerns about the direction of the Imperium. Advisors and remembrancers attached to his expedition fleets began to subtly influence his thinking, introducing concepts and ideas that challenged the fundamental assumptions of the imperial truth. The emergence of Horus as not just a military commander, but as a philosopher and leader of men created the perfect conditions for the corruption that would follow. His very virtues became the means by which the chaos gods could reach him. His love for his father made him vulnerable to feelings of abandonment and betrayal. His tactical genius made him susceptible to the promise of greater knowledge and power. His charismatic leadership made him the perfect vector for spreading corruption throughout the Imperium. The stage was set for the greatest tragedy in human history. The Emperor's most beloved son, the greatest military genius in the galaxy, the one being who could have led humanity to its ultimate destiny, was being prepared for a fall that would damn the species to 10,000 years of darkness. The emergence of Horus as Warmaster was not just the culmination of his rise to power, but the beginning of his descent into damnation. The documentary evidence of Horus Lupercal's unparalleled military genius reads like the chronicles of a living god of war. In the 2 centuries following his discovery on Chthoniya, the 16 Legion under his command achieved a compliance rate that exceeded even the most optimistic projections of the imperial war machine. Where other Primarchs might take months or years to bring a system into imperial fold, Horus routinely accomplished the same task in weeks, often without firing a single shot. The specific campaigns that showcased his tactical brilliance became legendary among the Space Marine legions, studied and analyzed by strategists across the galaxy. The Proxima Centauri compliance stands as perhaps the most perfect example of his methods. Faced with a human civilization that had regressed to feudal barbarism but possessed orbital defense platforms of Dark Age technology, Horus achieved total victory in 72 hours through a combination of psychological warfare, precision strikes, and diplomatic manipulation that left the defending forces convinced they were joining the winning side rather than surrendering to conquerors. The Battle of Gyros Thravian demonstrated his ability to coordinate multiple legion forces in a way that maximized their individual strengths while minimizing their inherent rivalries. The Iron Warrior's expertise in siege warfare, the Imperial Fist defensive capabilities, and the Luna Wolves' rapid assault tactics were woven together into a campaign that saw a fortress world that had resisted Imperial compliance for 3 years fall in a single coordinated strike lasting less than 18 hours. Archaeological records from the period reveal the reactions of other Primarchs to Horus's growing reputation. Rogel Dorn, perhaps the most tactically conservative of the Emperor's sons, wrote in his private logs that observing Horus in battle was like watching a master craftsman work, each decision flowing naturally from the last in a chain of causality that seemed almost preordained. Sanguinius, himself renowned for his tactical acumen, noted that Horus possessed an almost supernatural ability to anticipate not just enemy actions but the reactions of his own forces, allowing him to craft battle plans that accounted for variables that other commanders might not even consider. The growing cult of personality that surrounded the Warmaster was not merely the result of his military successes, but of his unique ability to inspire loyalty across the diverse cultures and mindsets that made up the Imperial forces: Space Marines, mortal soldiers, naval officers, and civilian administrators all found in Horus a leader who understood their concerns and valued their contributions. This was not mere charisma, but a genuine empathy that allowed him to connect with others on a level that few of his brothers could match. The escalating complexity of governing a galaxy-spanning empire presented challenges that tested even Horus's remarkable abilities. The compliance of the Interrex required not just military victory but the integration of a sophisticated alien-allied human civilization into the Imperial system. The diplomatic protocols alone took months to negotiate, requiring Horus to balance the demands of the Imperial truth with the practical realities of governing a population that had coexisted peacefully with Xenos for millennia. The burden of representing the Emperor's vision to the galaxy became increasingly apparent as Horus's responsibilities expanded. Imperial iterators, the civilian officials responsible for spreading the Imperial truth, began to defer to his interpretations of Imperial policy. Remembrancers attached to his expedition fleets would seek his approval for their artistic works, understanding that his opinion carried weight that could make or break careers. The Warmaster had become not just a military commander but the voice of Imperial authority in the outer darkness. The perfect record of compliance campaigns that Horus maintained was not achieved through reckless aggression or overwhelming force, but through an almost artistic understanding of how to apply exactly the right amount of pressure at exactly the right moment. The compliance of the Oretian technocracy, achieved through a combination of technological demonstration and strategic alliance, brought an entire sector into Imperial control without a single casualty. The subjugation of the Chromarch Empire, by contrast, required the complete destruction of their military caste, but was accomplished with such precision that civilian casualties were kept to an absolute minimum. His ability to unite disparate legion cultures under a single command structure was perhaps his greatest achievement. The Space Marine legions had been created with distinct tactical specializations and cultural identities that often led to friction when they were forced to work together. Horus alone possessed the combination of tactical genius and interpersonal skills necessary to take advantage of these differences rather than being hindered by them. The Luna Wolves became known throughout the Imperium as the legion that could work with anyone, and this reputation was entirely due to their Primarch's leadership. The universal acclaim that Horus received from his victories created a pressure that would eventually prove unbearable even for a being of his capabilities. Every success raised expectations higher. Every triumph was measured against increasingly impossible standards. The Emperor's decision to name him Warmaster was recognition of his achievements, but it also placed upon his shoulders the responsibility for maintaining the momentum of 2 centuries of continuous victory. The reactions from other Primarchs to Horus's elevation were complex and varied. Some, like Sanguinius and Fulgrim, offered their congratulations and support without reservation. Others, particularly those who had harbored their own ambitions for the position, found it more difficult to accept. The subtle jealousies and rivalries that had always existed among the Emperor's sons began to coalesce around the question of whether Horus truly deserved the unique position he had been granted. The growing recognition of his tactical brilliance extended beyond the military sphere, into the realm of Imperial administration. Planetary governors would request his arbitration in disputes, understanding that his decisions carried the weight of Imperial law. Trade negotiations would be conducted in his presence, with both parties seeking his approval for their agreements. The Warmaster had become not just a military commander, but the de facto ruler of the expanding Imperium. Yet beneath the surface of these triumphs, subtle signs of strain began to appear. The philosophical conversations that Horus held with his fellow Primarchs increasingly focused on the nature of their purpose and the question of what would happen when the Great Crusade was complete. The Emperor's withdrawal to Terra had created a void that Horus was expected to fill, but the magnitude of that responsibility was beginning to weigh on him in ways that pure military command never had. The burden of representing the Emperor's vision became particularly acute when dealing with populations that had developed their own sophisticated philosophies and belief systems. The compliance of worlds like the Interrex required Horus to articulate and defend the Imperial truth in ways that went far beyond simple military conquest. These intellectual challenges forced him to confront the limitations of his own understanding and to question assumptions that he had never before examined. The escalating complexity of imperial governance presented problems that could not be solved through tactical brilliance alone. Resource allocation across hundreds of worlds, the integration of diverse human cultures, the management of competing interests among the various imperial institutions. These were challenges that required not just intelligence but wisdom. Horus found himself making decisions that would affect billions of lives, often with incomplete information and under tremendous time pressure. The universal recognition of his capabilities created expectations that were ultimately impossible to meet. The Emperor's decision to withdraw from active command of the Great Crusade placed upon Horus the responsibility not just for military victory, but for embodying the imperial vision in all its complexity. This was a burden that would have challenged even the Emperor himself, and it was being placed upon the shoulders of a son who, despite his superhuman abilities, was still learning what it meant to rule rather than simply conquer. The first manifestations of Horus's power thus contained within them the seeds of his eventual fall. His very perfection as a military commander made him vulnerable to the corrupting influence of absolute responsibility. His ability to inspire loyalty in others made him susceptible to the manipulation of those who would exploit that loyalty for their own ends. His philosophical nature made him vulnerable to doubt and questioning that would eventually lead him to seek answers in forbidden places. The stage was being set for the greatest tragedy in human history, and the very qualities that made Horus the perfect Warmaster were being prepared to serve as the instruments of his corruption. The peak achievements of the Great Crusade under Horus's leadership represented the absolute zenith of human accomplishment in the galaxy. Never before or since has humanity wielded such power, commanded such resources, or possessed such unity of purpose. The organizational structure that Horus inherited from the Emperor and refined through his own genius created a war machine of unprecedented efficiency and effectiveness. 200 years of continuous expansion had brought over 1 million worlds under imperial control, each one adding to the growing strength of humanity's galactic empire. The technological mastery achieved during this golden age surpassed even the legendary accomplishments of the Dark Age of technology. The Space Marine legions represented the pinnacle of genetic engineering, each warrior a perfect fusion of human potential and scientific advancement. The Primarchs themselves were living proof of humanity's ability to transcend the limitations of biology and create beings that approach the divine in their capabilities. The Imperial war machine could deploy entire fleets across the galaxy in a matter of weeks, supported by logistical networks that spanned thousands of light years. The spiritual foundations of this golden age rested upon the Emperor's imperial truth, a philosophy that promised to liberate humanity from the superstition and ignorance that had plagued the species throughout its history. The rejection of gods and the embrace of reason were not merely intellectual positions but the cornerstone of imperial policy. The Imperium represented humanity's graduation from primitive belief systems to mature understanding of the universe's true nature. Science, not faith, would guide the species to its ultimate destiny among the stars. The organizational structure at the height of imperial power was a marvel of efficiency and coordination. The Council of Terra handled the administrative aspects of governance, while the Primarchs led their legions in the field. The Adeptus Mechanicus provided technological support, the Imperial Army supplied manpower, and the Imperial Navy maintained control of the space lanes. Each institution had its role, each served the greater whole, and all were united under the Emperor's vision of human greatness. The 18 Space Marine legions represented the ultimate expression of the Emperor's genetic mastery. Each legion was a brotherhood of warriors bred for specific tactical roles, yet capable of adapting to any battlefield condition. The Ultramarines excelled at combined arms warfare, the Imperial Fists at defensive operations, the White Scars at rapid assault tactics. Together, they formed a military instrument that could conquer any enemy, overcome any obstacle, and bring compliance to any world that dared to resist imperial authority. The scale of achievement during this period defied comprehension. Entire sectors of the galaxy were brought into compliance within single campaign seasons. Alien empires that had ruled for millennia were swept away in months. Human worlds that had been isolated for thousands of years were reunited with their species and elevated to unprecedented levels of prosperity and security. The Great Crusade was not merely a military campaign but a renaissance of human civilization on a galactic scale. The hidden vulnerabilities within this perfect system were subtle but profound. The Emperor's decision to conceal the true nature of the warp from his sons created a fundamental weakness in Imperial doctrine. The Primarchs, despite their superhuman intelligence and wisdom, were operating without complete information about the universe they were conquering. The rejection of the spiritual realm left them vulnerable to forces that operated according to principles that the Imperial truth simply did not acknowledge. The concentration of power in the hands of the Primarchs created potential points of failure that the Emperor had not adequately addressed. Each legion was bound to its Primarch through genetic and psychological bonds that transcended normal military loyalty. The corruption of a single Primarch could potentially compromise an entire legion, and the corruption of the right Primarch could threaten the entire Imperial system. This was not a theoretical concern but a practical vulnerability that would prove catastrophic. The reliance on the Emperor's personal presence and authority created a system that was inherently fragile. The decision to withdraw from active command of the Great Crusade and delegate authority to Horus was necessary but dangerous. The Imperium had been built around the Emperor's unique abilities and insights, and his absence created a void that no single individual, not even his most gifted son, could completely fill. The transition from direct to indirect rule was a moment of maximum vulnerability. The philosophical foundations of the Imperial truth contained internal contradictions that would eventually prove fatal. The rejection of the divine while simultaneously elevating the Emperor to godlike status created cognitive dissonance that thinking individuals could not ignore indefinitely. The promise of a rational secular society while maintaining authoritarian control over human thought and behavior was a tension that would eventually require resolution. The suppression of spiritual needs while engaging in activities that had profound spiritual implications was a policy that invited corruption. The logistical achievements of the Great Crusade masked underlying problems that would become critical during the coming civil war. The supply lines that supported the advancing legions were vulnerable to disruption. The communication networks that coordinated Imperial forces could be compromised, and the administrative systems that governed conquered worlds were dependent on continued Imperial authority. The very success of the Great Crusade had created a system of such complexity that it required constant maintenance and perfect coordination to function effectively. The psychological impact of continuous victory on the Space Marine legions was another hidden vulnerability. The Astartes had been created for war. Their entire identity built around the concept of conquest and victory. The prospect of peace, which was supposedly the ultimate goal of the Great Crusade, represented not reward but extinction for warrior cultures that had never known any other purpose. This existential anxiety created fertile ground for alternative philosophies that promised eternal war and eternal purpose. The technological marvels of the Golden Age were dependent on knowledge and resources that could not be easily replaced if lost. The gene laboratories that produced Space Marines, the forges that manufactured their equipment, the shipyards that built their vessels, all represented irreplaceable assets that had taken centuries to develop. The concentration of these facilities in key locations created strategic vulnerabilities that could be exploited by enemies who understood the Imperial system's dependencies. The cultural unity that seemed to characterize the Imperium at its height was actually a thin veneer overlaying deep divisions and resentments. The various human cultures that had been brought into Imperial compliance retained their distinct identities and priorities, held together primarily by Imperial military power and the promise of shared prosperity. The removal of that unifying force would inevitably lead to the resurgence of ancient rivalries and conflicts that had never been truly resolved. The spiritual vacuum created by the rejection of traditional belief systems had been filled by worship of the Emperor and the Imperial system itself. This pseudo-religious devotion was psychologically satisfying but intellectually unstable, creating a form of faith that was vulnerable to challenge and corruption. The human need for meaning and purpose could not be permanently suppressed by rational philosophy, and the eventual resurgence of spiritual concerns would find expression in forms that the Imperial truth was unprepared to address. The Golden Age foundations of the Imperium were thus built upon assumptions that would prove false, dependencies that would prove fragile, and contradictions that would prove fatal. The very perfection of the system at its height contained within it the seeds of its own destruction. The Emperor's greatest achievement was also his greatest vulnerability, and the instrument of that vulnerability was the son he loved most. The corruption of Horus would not merely damage the Imperium, but reveal the fundamental flaws that had been present from the beginning. hidden beneath the glory of 2 centuries of continuous victory. The stage was set for the greatest fall in human history, and the golden age that seemed so permanent and perfect was about to reveal itself as nothing more than a beautiful dream on the verge of becoming humanity's darkest nightmare. The core philosophy that drove Horus Lupercal's expansion of imperial authority went far beyond simple military conquest. Where other primarchs might view compliance as the end goal of their campaigns, Horus understood it as merely the beginning of a longer process of cultural and spiritual transformation. His approach to bringing human worlds into the imperial fold was characterized by a sophisticated understanding of how civilizations could be reshaped from within, their existing power structures co-opted and redirected toward imperial purposes rather than simply destroyed and replaced. The successful implementations of his leadership philosophy could be seen across dozens of sectors where the Luna Wolves had achieved compliance. The Davinite system, brought into imperial control through a combination of military demonstration and diplomatic negotiation, became a model for how isolated human cultures could be integrated into the greater imperial framework while maintaining their essential character. The local warrior traditions were preserved and channeled into imperial service. The existing religious practices were gradually replaced with imperial truth doctrine, and the planetary leadership was maintained but subordinated to imperial authority. The expansion approaches that Horus pioneered emphasized the importance of understanding local conditions and adapting imperial methods to fit specific circumstances. Unlike the rigid compliance protocols that some legions employed, the Luna Wolves under Horus's command demonstrated remarkable flexibility in their methods. The agricultural worlds of the Coronid Deeps required different treatment than the industrial hellscapes of the Raptoran sector, and Horus possessed the intellectual sophistication to develop appropriate strategies for each situation. The reactions from other primarchs to Horus's methods were complex and varied. Some, like Robout Guilliman, admired the efficiency and thoroughness of his approach, seeing in it a model for how the post-Crusade Imperium might be governed. Others, particularly those of a more martial disposition like Angron or Perturbo, questioned whether such elaborate methods were necessary when simple force could achieve the same results more quickly. This philosophical divide among the Emperor's sons would prove significant in the events that were to follow. The growing complications and challenges that arose from Horus's expanding influence were not immediately apparent to most observers. The warrior lodges that had formed within the Luna Wolves and several other legions were initially seen as beneficial institutions that promoted brotherhood and unity among the Astartes. These informal gatherings, where space marines from different companies and specializations could meet as equals, seemed to strengthen the bonds that held the legions together and provided outlets for the intellectual and spiritual needs that military service alone could not satisfy. The philosophical foundations of Horus's approach to leadership were rooted in his understanding of human nature and the psychological forces that drove individuals and civilizations. He had observed that lasting change required not just external compliance but internal acceptance, and that the most effective way to achieve this was through a combination of demonstration, persuasion, and gradual transformation. This understanding made him incredibly effective as a leader, but it also made him vulnerable to those who would use similar methods against him. The successful examples of Horus's leadership extended far beyond the battlefield into the realm of imperial administration and governance. The sector fleets under his command became known throughout the Imperium for their efficiency and effectiveness, not just in military operations but in the complex tasks of planetary governance, resource allocation, and cultural integration. The Luna Wolves developed expertise in areas that other legions considered beneath their notice, creating a comprehensive approach to imperial expansion that served as a model for the entire Great Crusade. The subtle changes in legion culture that began to emerge during this period were initially seen as positive developments. The Luna Wolves became more intellectually curious, more willing to engage with complex ideas and alternative perspectives. They developed a reputation for being excellent collaborators, able to work effectively with other legions, imperial army units, and civilian authorities. This cultural evolution was seen as evidence of their primarch's wisdom and leadership, but it also created vulnerabilities that would later be exploited. The growing frequency of philosophical discussions within the Legion reflected Horus's own intellectual development, and his increasing engagement with fundamental questions about the nature of the Imperium and humanity's destiny. These conversations, which took place in the informal settings of the warrior lodges, ranged across topics that included the purpose of the Great Crusade, the nature of the Imperial truth, and the question of what would happen when there were no more worlds to conquer. The level of intellectual sophistication displayed in these discussions was unprecedented among the Space Marine legions. The reactions from Imperial authorities to Horus's methods were generally positive, though some expressed concern about the complexity and resource requirements of his approach. The Council of Terra appreciated the thoroughness of his compliance operations and the low rates of rebellion in sectors that had been brought into Imperial control by the Luna Wolves. The Adeptus Mechanicus found his willingness to engage with technological and scientific questions refreshing compared to the anti-intellectual attitudes of some other legions. The growing complications that arose from Horus's expanding influence were subtle but significant. The warrior lodges that had begun as simple social organizations gradually developed their own rituals, traditions, and hierarchies that existed parallel to the formal legion command structure. These informal networks created new channels of communication and influence that bypassed traditional authority relationships, potentially undermining the unity of command that was essential to Space Marine effectiveness. The challenges presented by governing an increasingly complex and diverse empire began to weigh heavily on Horus's mind. The simple certainties of the early Great Crusade, when the path forward seemed clear and the Emperor's vision was unquestioned, had given way to a more complex reality where difficult decisions had to be made with incomplete information and uncertain outcomes. The burden of representing the Emperor's will to the galaxy while the Emperor himself remained distant and uncommunicative created psychological pressures that even a Primarch found difficult to bear. The introduction of new advisors and counselors into Horus's inner circle reflected his growing need for intellectual stimulation and philosophical guidance. These individuals, drawn from various backgrounds and disciplines, brought with them perspectives and ideas that challenged the orthodox imperial worldview. The presence of figures like Erebus of the Word Bearers, who spoke eloquently about the spiritual dimensions of existence, began to influence the conversations that took place within the warrior lodges and the broader legion culture. The expansion of Horus's influence across multiple sectors of the galaxy created a situation where his personal philosophy and methods were being implemented by thousands of individuals who might not fully understand the principles behind them. This process of cultural transmission inevitably led to distortions and misinterpretations. As complex ideas were simplified and adapted to fit local conditions, the result was a gradual drift away from orthodox imperial doctrine, often in ways that were too subtle to be immediately detected. The growing recognition of Horus as not just a military commander, but as a philosopher and thought leader created expectations that went far beyond his original role. Imperial officials, legion commanders, and civilian administrators began to look to him for guidance on matters that were well outside the scope of military command. This expansion of his influence was flattering but also dangerous, as it placed him in the position of having to provide answers to questions that he was not necessarily equipped to address. The successful implementation of his methods across multiple campaigns created a sense of confidence and pride within the Luna Wolves that would later prove problematic. The Legion began to see itself as uniquely enlightened and sophisticated compared to their brother legions, developing a subtle arrogance that made them susceptible to flattery and manipulation. This cultural shift was encouraged by the very success of their methods, creating a feedback loop that reinforced their sense of superiority and special destiny. The philosophical foundations of Horus's approach contained within them the seeds of rebellion against the imperial system itself. His emphasis on understanding and adaptation rather than blind obedience created a mindset that was inherently questioning and critical. When combined with the growing doubts about the Emperor's wisdom and the increasing complexity of imperial governance, this philosophical flexibility became a pathway toward the corruption that would eventually consume him and his legion. The spreading influence of Horus's methods and philosophy thus created the perfect conditions for the disaster that was to follow. The very success of his approach made him vulnerable to those who would exploit his methods for their own purposes, and the intellectual sophistication of his legion made them susceptible to ideas that would have been rejected by less thoughtful warriors. The stage was being set for the greatest betrayal in human history, and the instrument of that betrayal was being prepared through the very qualities that made Horus the most effective of the Emperor's sons. The subtle anomalies that began to appear in the wake of Horus's most successful campaigns were initially dismissed as minor curiosities, the kind of inexplicable phenomena that inevitably occurred when dealing with the vastness and complexity of galactic warfare. After the compliance of the Aureus system, several Luna Wolves reported experiencing unusually vivid dreams that seemed to continue themes and imagery from their waking hours. These dreams, while disturbing in their intensity, were rationalized as the natural psychological response to the stress of continuous campaigning and the exotic environments encountered during interstellar travel. The growing frequency of these problems became apparent only when viewed retrospectively, as individual incidents that seemed insignificant in isolation began to form a pattern when considered collectively. The warrior lodges that had been established within the Luna Wolves and several other legions began to report an increasing number of members who experienced what they described as spiritual awakenings or moments of profound insight. These experiences, while deeply meaningful to those who underwent them, were difficult to explain within the rational framework of the Imperial truth. The failed explanations offered by Imperial authorities for these phenomena revealed the fundamental weakness in the Imperial worldview. The rejection of the supernatural and the emphasis on rational, scientific explanations for all phenomena left the Imperium ill-equipped to deal with events that did not conform to materialist assumptions. When Space Marines began reporting encounters with entities that seemed to exist outside normal space-time, the official response was to classify these reports as hallucinations or psychological aberrations rather than investigate the possibility that they might represent genuine supernatural phenomena. The rationalizations offered for increasingly bizarre incidents became more elaborate and less convincing, as the anomalies became more frequent and more difficult to ignore. The appearance of symbols and iconography that seemed to have no connection to any known human culture was explained as the result of convergent evolution in symbolic thinking. The occurrence of prophetic dreams that accurately predicted future events was dismissed as coincidence or the subconscious processing of available information. The manifestation of apparently impossible phenomena during certain ritual activities was attributed to mass hallucination or the effects of exotic atmospheric conditions. The clues pointing to underlying causes became more obvious to those who knew how to interpret them, though the full significance of these signs would not become apparent until much later. The warrior lodges that had begun as simple social organizations gradually developed increasingly elaborate ritual practices that seemed to draw inspiration from sources that existed outside Imperial doctrine. The participants in these rituals reported feelings of connection to larger cosmic forces and experiences of transcendence that were difficult to describe in rational terms. The influence of advisors and counselors who had been drawn into Horus's inner circle began to manifest in subtle changes in his thinking and behavior. Erebus of the Word Bearers, in particular, proved to be a compelling conversationalist whose discussions of spiritual matters provided intellectual stimulation that Horus found increasingly addictive. These conversations, which initially seemed like harmless philosophical speculation, gradually introduced concepts and ideas that challenged the fundamental assumptions of the Imperial truth. The early warnings that should have alerted Imperial authorities to the growing threat were either ignored or misinterpreted due to the ideological blindness created by the Imperial truth. The Interrex encountered during one of Horus's most successful compliance campaigns had specifically warned about the dangers of what they called chaos, describing it as a corrupting force that could turn the greatest heroes into humanity's worst enemies. These warnings were dismissed as primitive superstition, despite the obvious sophistication of Interrex civilization and their success in maintaining stability for millennia. The growing frequency of incidents that could not be explained within the rational framework of Imperial doctrine began to create psychological stress among those who witnessed them. Space Marines who had been trained to analyze and understand their environment found themselves confronting phenomena that defied analysis and understanding. The cognitive dissonance created by these experiences began to weaken their faith in the Imperial truth and make them more susceptible to alternative explanations for the nature of reality. The subtle changes in behavior displayed by those who had been most directly exposed to these anomalous phenomena were initially attributed to the natural psychological effects of continuous warfare and the stress of command responsibility. Horus himself began to display signs of intellectual restlessness and spiritual hunger that his advisors were all too eager to address. His questions about the nature of the universe and humanity's place within it became more frequent and more searching, creating opportunities for those who possessed forbidden knowledge to influence his thinking. The patterns of occurrence that emerged from careful analysis of these incidents suggested that they were not random but followed some form of underlying logic or purpose. The anomalies seemed to cluster around certain individuals, particularly those who possessed strong leadership qualities or exceptional psychic potential. The warrior lodges that had been established within the legions appeared to serve as focal points for these phenomena, as if their ritual activities were somehow attracting or amplifying the mysterious forces involved. The innocent explanations that were offered for the increasingly elaborate ritual practices that developed within the warrior lodges became less credible as these practices began to produce measurable effects on the participants. The sense of brotherhood and unity that had originally motivated the formation of these organizations was gradually replaced by something more intense and more dangerous. The rituals themselves began to incorporate elements that seemed to draw from sources outside human experience, suggesting that the participants were receiving inspiration from external intelligences. The serious threats that these developments represented were masked by their gradual and subtle nature. The corruption of the Luna Wolves and their allied legions was not a sudden transformation, but a slow process of erosion that undermined their loyalty and discipline from within. The very qualities that made them effective warriors also made them vulnerable to corruption, as their courage and dedication could be redirected toward purposes that served the interests of humanity's enemies rather than humanity itself. The larger pattern that was becoming apparent to those few individuals who possessed the knowledge and perspective to recognize it was that the Imperium was under attack from forces that operated according to principles that Imperial doctrine refused to acknowledge. The Chaos Gods, ancient entities that fed on human emotion and psychic energy, had identified the Great Crusade as both a threat to their existence and an opportunity to corrupt humanity's greatest champions. The corruption of Horus was not an accident, but the culmination of a carefully orchestrated campaign that had been building for decades. The ominous implications of these developments were lost on most imperial authorities, who continued to interpret the signs of corruption within the familiar framework of political rivalry and personal ambition. The possibility that their enemies might include actual supernatural entities with the power to corrupt even the most loyal servants of the Emperor was too far outside their worldview to be seriously considered. This blindness to the true nature of the threat would prove catastrophic when the corruption finally reached the point where it could no longer be hidden or denied. The stage was being set for the greatest betrayal in human history, and the instrument of that betrayal was being prepared through the slow corruption of the Emperor's most beloved son. The signs of this corruption were there for those who knew how to read them, but the ideology that had made the Great Crusade possible also made it impossible for imperial authorities to recognize the true nature of the threat they faced. The first signs of corruption were not just warnings of what was to come, but evidence that the process of damnation was already well underway. The nature of chaos corruption differed fundamentally from any threat that the Imperium had previously encountered, and this difference made it uniquely dangerous to a civilization that had built its entire worldview around the rejection of the supernatural. Unlike the alien empires that could be defeated through superior firepower or the rebellious human worlds that could be brought to heel through conventional military action, chaos operated according to principles that the imperial truth simply did not acknowledge. The corruption spread not through conquest but through temptation, not through force but through the gradual erosion of moral certainty and spiritual faith. The first direct confrontations with demonic entities occurred during what should have been routine compliance operations, when Imperial forces encountered defenders whose capabilities exceeded anything that baseline humans or even abhuman variants should have been able to achieve. On the world of 6319, Luna Wolves assault squads reported engaging enemy soldiers who continued fighting despite wounds that should have been instantly fatal, whose weapons seemed to fire ammunition that existed only intermittently, and whose battle cries caused measurable psychological effects on hardened space marines who had never known fear. The escalating spiritual conflict within the legions manifested in ways that were subtle but profoundly disturbing to those who witnessed them. The warrior lodges that had been established as social organizations began to develop increasingly elaborate ritual practices that seemed to draw inspiration from sources that existed outside imperial doctrine. Participants reported experiences of transcendence and connection to cosmic forces that were difficult to describe in rational terms, but which provided a sense of meaning and purpose that military service alone could not satisfy. The desperate measures taken to maintain the imperial truth in the face of undeniable supernatural events revealed the fundamental weakness in the imperial worldview. When Space Marines began reporting encounters with entities that seemed to exist outside normal spacetime, the official response was to classify these reports as hallucinations or psychological aberrations, rather than investigate the possibility that they might represent genuine supernatural phenomena. This willful blindness to the evidence of their own senses created a crisis of confidence among imperial forces that would prove catastrophic. The devastatingly effective nature of chaos corruption against Imperial rationalism became apparent when entire units of Space Marines began to question the fundamental assumptions upon which their training and indoctrination had been based. The Imperial truth, which had served as the ideological foundation for 2 centuries of conquest, suddenly seemed inadequate to explain the reality that Imperial forces were encountering in the field. The rejection of the divine while simultaneously demanding absolute loyalty to the Emperor created cognitive dissonance that thinking individuals could not ignore indefinitely. The growing warp instability that accompanied the expansion of chaos influence made interstellar travel increasingly dangerous and unpredictable. Navigator houses began reporting unusual phenomena during warp transit, including the appearance of entities that seemed to take active interest in Imperial vessels and their crews. Astropaths found their communications increasingly disrupted by what they described as hostile interference from intelligences that existed within the Sea of Souls itself. The very infrastructure that made the Imperium possible was being systematically undermined by forces that Imperial doctrine refused to acknowledge. The costly victories that Imperial forces achieved against chaos-corrupted opponents revealed the true nature of the threat they faced. Unlike conventional enemies who could be defeated through superior tactics or overwhelming firepower, chaos corruption seemed to grow stronger through conflict itself. Every act of violence, every moment of despair, every surge of hatred or fear seemed to feed the very forces that Imperial troops were trying to combat. The traditional military solutions that had served the Imperium so well during the Great Crusade were not only ineffective against this new threat, but actively counterproductive. The warnings that had been provided by the Interrex and other human civilizations that had encountered chaos began to take on new significance as Imperial forces gained first-hand experience of the threat. The sophisticated anti-chaos protocols that these civilizations had developed over millennia stood in stark contrast to the Imperial approach of simply denying that the threat existed. The rejection of this accumulated wisdom in favor of Imperial arrogance and ideological purity would prove to be one of the most catastrophic mistakes in human history. The ability of chaos corruption to undermine the very foundations of Imperial loyalty and discipline became apparent as trusted officers and veteran Space Marines began to display signs of spiritual transformation that were impossible to explain within the framework of Imperial doctrine. The corruption did not announce itself with obvious signs of mutation or madness, but instead manifested as a gradual shift in priorities and values that made the corrupted individuals more effective in some ways while simultaneously making them unreliable in others. The escalating frequency of incidents that could not be explained within the rational framework of Imperial doctrine began to create a crisis of faith among Imperial forces. The Space Marines who had been trained to analyze and understand their environment found themselves confronting phenomena that defied analysis and understanding. The cognitive dissonance created by these experiences began to weaken their faith in the Imperial truth and make them more susceptible to alternative explanations for the nature of reality. The systematic nature of the threat became apparent when intelligence analysis revealed that the various incidents of chaos corruption were not random, but followed patterns that suggested coordination and planning by intelligences of vast scope and sophistication. The corruption seemed to target specific individuals and institutions that were critical to Imperial stability, with particular attention paid to those who possessed the greatest potential for both good and evil. The realization that humanity was under attack by entities that could think and plan on a galactic scale was perhaps the most terrifying discovery of all. The psychological warfare aspects of chaos corruption proved to be particularly effective against Imperial forces who had been trained to value courage, honor, and loyalty above all else. The corruption offered these virtues in abundance, but twisted them toward purposes that served the interests of humanity's enemies rather than humanity itself. The Space Marines who fell to chaos corruption did not become cowards or traitors in the conventional sense, but instead became fanatically dedicated to causes that were antithetical to everything the Imperium claimed to represent. The growing problems that resulted from the Imperial refusal to acknowledge the spiritual dimension of the threat manifested in multiple ways across the expanding war zone. Military units that had been exposed to chaos corruption began to display increasingly erratic behavior, with loyalty and discipline breaking down in ways that conventional military training could not address. The command structure that had served the Imperium so well during the Great Crusade proved inadequate to deal with threats that operated according to principles that Imperial doctrine refused to acknowledge. The revelation that the threat could corrupt the very foundations of Imperial ideology became apparent when respected Imperial authorities began to advocate for policies and practices that were fundamentally incompatible with the Imperial truth. The gradual shift from rational skepticism to dogmatic denial created an environment where critical thinking was discouraged and legitimate concerns were dismissed as heretical speculation. This intellectual rigidity made Imperial forces even more vulnerable to corruption by entities that understood the power of ideas and the importance of controlling the narrative. The scope of the threat became fully apparent when analysis revealed that the corruption was not limited to military units, but had spread throughout Imperial society. Civilian administrators, technical specialists, and even members of the Adeptus Mechanicus began to display signs of spiritual transformation that suggested exposure to influences that existed outside the material universe. The realization that the entire Imperial system was under attack from within created a crisis of confidence that would have catastrophic consequences for Imperial unity and effectiveness. The desperate innovations that Imperial authorities attempted in response to the growing threat revealed the depth of their misunderstanding of the forces they faced. The increased emphasis on surveillance and ideological purity, while understandable from a conventional military perspective, actually made Imperial forces more vulnerable to corruption by creating an atmosphere of suspicion and fear that the Chaos Gods found particularly nourishing. The very measures that were intended to protect the Imperium from corruption instead accelerated the process of spiritual decay. The point of no return was reached when the corruption spread to the highest levels of Imperial command, including advisors and counselors who had direct access to the Warmaster himself. The gradual influence of figures like Erebus of the Wordbearers created a situation where the corruption was being spread through the very channels that were supposed to maintain Imperial unity and discipline. The realization that the threat had penetrated to the heart of Imperial authority made it clear that conventional responses would be inadequate to address the crisis. The rising threat of chaos corruption thus represented not just a military challenge, but a fundamental crisis of Imperial civilization itself. The ideology that had made the Great Crusade possible also made it impossible for Imperial authorities to recognize the true nature of the threat they faced. The stage was being set for the greatest betrayal in human history, and the instrument of that betrayal was being prepared through the systematic corruption of the Emperor's most beloved son and his most trusted advisors. The Emperor's abandonment of the Great Crusade for the mysterious Webway project represented the most controversial decision of his reign, a choice that would reverberate through the ages and ultimately contribute to the catastrophe that followed. The withdrawal of the Master of Mankind from active command at the moment when his presence was most needed created a void in Imperial leadership that no single individual, not even his most gifted son, could adequately fill. The official explanation that the Emperor was engaged in a great work that would benefit all humanity was accepted without question by most Imperial authorities, but the lack of specific details created an atmosphere of uncertainty and doubt that would prove corrosive to Imperial unity. The dangerous experiments with forbidden knowledge that began during this period were initially justified as necessary responses to the unprecedented threats that Imperial forces were encountering in the field. The librarian programs that had been established within the Space Marine legions were expanded and intensified, with psychers being pushed to explore the limits of their abilities in order to understand the nature of the supernatural phenomena that were becoming increasingly common. These experiments, while producing valuable intelligence about the nature of chaos corruption, also exposed the participants to spiritual influences that Imperial doctrine was not equipped to address. The Council of Nicaea, convened to address the growing concerns about the use of psychic powers within the Imperial military, represented a critical moment in the development of the crisis that would eventually consume the galaxy. The debate between those who advocated for the continued development of psychic abilities and those who called for their complete suppression revealed fundamental disagreements about the nature of the universe and humanity's place within it. The Emperor's decision to ban the use of psychic powers except by sanctioned individuals was intended to protect the Imperium from corruption, but it also removed one of the few effective tools that Imperial forces possessed for combating chaos influence. The unintended consequences of the Nicaea decree became apparent almost immediately, as the suppression of librarian programs left Imperial forces even more vulnerable to psychic attack and manipulation. The Space Marines, who had been trained to detect and counter supernatural threats, were forced to abandon their abilities and pretend that the phenomena they had witnessed did not exist. This willful blindness to the reality of the supernatural created a situation where chaos corruption could spread unchecked, hidden from official scrutiny by the very regulations that were supposed to prevent it. The point of no return in Horus's rebellion against imperial authority was reached not through a single dramatic moment, but through a gradual accumulation of doubts and resentments that finally crystallized into open defiance. The philosophical conversations that had taken place within the warrior lodges gradually evolved into explicit criticism of imperial policy and the emperor's leadership. The influence of advisors like Erebus, who possessed detailed knowledge of the spiritual forces that imperial doctrine refused to acknowledge, provided intellectual justification for the growing rebellion against imperial authority. The desperate solutions that exceeded expectations but created hidden vulnerabilities could be seen in the various attempts to address the growing crisis through conventional military and administrative means. The increased emphasis on surveillance and ideological purity, while understandable from a security perspective, actually made imperial forces more vulnerable to corruption by creating an atmosphere of suspicion and fear that the Chaos Gods found particularly nourishing. The very measures that were intended to protect the Imperium from corruption instead accelerated the process of spiritual decay. The innovations that created worse problems than they solved were particularly evident in the attempts to maintain imperial unity through increased centralization of authority. The decision to grant Horus expanded powers as Warmaster was intended to compensate for the Emperor's absence, but it also created a single point of failure that could be exploited by those who understood the true nature of the threat. The concentration of authority in the hands of an individual who was gradually being corrupted by forces that imperial doctrine refused to acknowledge created a situation where the corruption could spread throughout the entire imperial system. The crossing of the point of no return was marked by the moment when Horus began to openly question not just specific imperial policies, but the fundamental assumptions upon which the entire imperial system was based. The conversations that had begun as philosophical speculation about the nature of the universe and humanity's destiny gradually evolved into explicit criticism of the Emperor's wisdom and authority. The influence of chaos corruption was not immediately apparent in these discussions, but the gradual shift in Horus's thinking created the conditions for the more dramatic transformation that would follow. The abandonment of principles that had previously been considered inviolable became apparent as imperial authorities began to adopt policies and practices that were fundamentally incompatible with the imperial truth. The use of increasingly harsh measures to maintain discipline and loyalty, while justified as necessary responses to the growing crisis, actually undermined the very values that the Imperium claimed to represent. The gradual transformation of imperial society from a rational, enlightened civilization into a paranoid, authoritarian regime created conditions that were ideal for the spread of chaos corruption. The discarded safeguards that had been established to protect the Imperium from corruption were systematically dismantled in the name of efficiency and security. The checks and balances that had been built into the imperial system to prevent the concentration of power in the hands of any single individual were gradually eroded through a series of administrative reforms that were presented as necessary improvements. The removal of these institutional protections created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by those who understood the true nature of the threat. The experimental methods that were adopted to address the growing crisis often involved the use of techniques and technologies that had been previously considered too dangerous or morally questionable to employ. The increasing reliance on surveillance and psychological manipulation, while effective in identifying and neutralizing specific threats, also created an atmosphere of mistrust and fear that was corrosive to imperial unity. The gradual erosion of civil liberties and personal freedoms in the name of security created conditions that were ideal for the spread of totalitarian ideologies. The backfiring of these desperate innovations became apparent as the measures that were intended to strengthen imperial authority instead weakened it by undermining the trust and loyalty that had been the foundation of imperial success. The increasing emphasis on ideological purity and unquestioning obedience created an environment where critical thinking was discouraged and legitimate concerns were dismissed as heretical speculation. This intellectual rigidity made imperial forces even more vulnerable to corruption by entities that understood the power of ideas and the importance of controlling the narrative. The moment of crossing the point of no return was marked by the realization that the corruption had spread to the highest levels of imperial command, including advisors and counselors who had direct access to the Warmaster himself. The gradual influence of figures like Erebus of the Word Bearers created a situation where the corruption was being spread through the very channels that were supposed to maintain imperial unity and discipline. The realization that the threat had penetrated to the heart of imperial authority made it clear that conventional responses would be inadequate to address the crisis. The theoretical applications that were explored during this period often involved the use of knowledge and techniques that had been previously considered forbidden or dangerous. The increasing reliance on esoteric sources of information and unconventional methods of analysis reflected the growing desperation of imperial authorities to understand and combat the threats they faced. The exploration of these theoretical possibilities, while producing valuable insights about the nature of chaos corruption, also exposed the participants to spiritual influences that imperial doctrine was not equipped to address. The cutting-edge developments that emerged from these desperate innovations often involved the fusion of scientific and spiritual approaches to understanding the universe. The recognition that the material and immaterial realms were interconnected in ways that imperial doctrine had not acknowledged created opportunities for new forms of knowledge and understanding. However, these developments also created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by entities that possessed greater knowledge of the spiritual dimension of reality. The unprecedented actions that were taken during this period reflected the growing recognition that conventional approaches were inadequate to address the crisis that was developing. The willingness to experiment with forbidden knowledge and dangerous techniques, while understandable given the circumstances, also created conditions that were ideal for the spread of chaos corruption. The crossing of lines that had never been crossed before was both necessary and dangerous, creating opportunities for both salvation and damnation that would ultimately determine the fate of the galaxy. The desperate innovations of this period thus represented both the height of imperial ingenuity and the beginning of its fall. The very measures that were intended to protect the Imperium from corruption instead created the conditions for the greatest betrayal in human history. The stage was being set for the moment when the Emperor's most beloved son would finally succumb to the forces that had been systematically corrupting him for decades, and the galaxy would learn the true cost of denying the spiritual dimension of reality. The origins of Horus's corruption on the feral world of Davin represented the culmination of a conspiracy that had been building for decades, orchestrated by forces that the imperial truth insisted did not exist. The world itself had been chosen with infinite care by the Word Bearers and their chaos allies. A planet where the barrier between the material realm and the warp had been deliberately weakened through generations of ritual sacrifice and daemon worship. The indigenous population, corrupted by centuries of exposure to chaos influence, served as the perfect instruments for the final phase of the plan to turn the Emperor's most beloved son against his father. The turning point when humanity's greatest champion became its destroyer began with what appeared to be a routine compliance operation against a rebellious planetary governor. The forces of Davin, led by the former Imperial commander Yugen Temba, had been enhanced by daemonic influence to a degree that made them far more dangerous than intelligence reports had suggested. The fighting was bitter and prolonged, with the Luna Wolves encountering resistance that seemed to anticipate their every move and adapt to their tactics with supernatural prescience. It was during this campaign that Horus sustained the wound that would provide the opening for his corruption. The blade that struck down the Warmaster had been blessed by the Chaos Gods themselves, forged in the fires of the warp and imbued with spiritual poison that could corrupt even the pure physiology of a Primarch. The weapon, wielded by the corrupted Yugen Temba, carried within it the concentrated malevolence of all four Chaos Gods, each contributing their own particular form of corruption to the mixture. The physical wound was merely the vector for a spiritual infection that would prove far more devastating than any conventional injury. The spreading corruption through the Luna Wolves and their allied legions began the moment that Horus was taken to the Temple of the Serpent Lodge for healing. The chaplain Erebus, who had orchestrated the entire sequence of events, presented the decision to seek aid from the local healers as a reasonable response to the failure of Imperial medical technology to address the Primarch's condition. The temple, dedicated to powers that the Imperial truth declared to be mythological, became the site of the most catastrophic spiritual transformation in human history. The ritual that was performed in the depths of the temple was presented as a healing ceremony, but it was actually a carefully orchestrated corruption process that had been designed specifically to exploit the psychological and spiritual vulnerabilities of the Warmaster. The ceremony drew upon the accumulated power of the Chaos Gods, channeling their influence through the weakened barrier between the material and immaterial realms. The participants, believing they were saving their beloved commander, instead became accomplices in his damnation. The final realization of the heresy's true scope came when Horus emerged from the temple, fundamentally transformed. His loyalty to the Emperor replaced by an obsessive hatred that consumed all other considerations. The corruption had not merely changed his allegiance, but had rewritten the fundamental structures of his personality, turning his greatest virtues into instruments of destruction. His love for his father became hatred, his protective instincts toward humanity became contempt, and his desire for unity became a drive toward domination. The revelation that trusted sources of imperial strength had been compromised became apparent when other Primarchs began to declare their support for Horus's rebellion against the Emperor. The corruption had spread through the network of personal relationships and institutional connections that had been the foundation of imperial unity. The warrior lodges that had been established within the legions served as vectors for the transmission of corrupt ideas and spiritual poison, turning the very bonds of brotherhood that had made the Space Marines so effective into instruments of their destruction. The challenging of fundamental beliefs about loyalty and duty through shocking discoveries occurred when loyal Imperial forces first encountered their former brothers-in-arms on the battlefield. The virus bombing of Isstvan III, where Horus attempted to eliminate the loyalist elements within his own forces, demonstrated the complete transformation of the Warmaster's character. The soldiers who had once served the Emperor with absolute dedication now turned their weapons against their former comrades with equal fervor, their loyalty redirected toward the service of powers that sought humanity's destruction. The full scale of the betrayal becoming apparent to the Loyalists was perhaps the most devastating aspect of the entire catastrophe. The realization that half of the Space Marine legions had turned traitor, that the Emperor's own sons had raised their hands against their father, that the very institutions that had been created to protect humanity had become instruments of its destruction, struck at the heart of everything that the Imperium claimed to represent. The betrayal was not just military but spiritual, a fundamental violation of the trust that had been the foundation of Imperial civilization. The trusted sources that had been compromised included not just military units, but the entire network of advisors, administrators, and specialists who had been responsible for maintaining Imperial unity and discipline. The corruption had spread through the channels of official communication and authority, turning the very mechanisms that were supposed to protect the Imperium into instruments of its destruction. The realization that the betrayal had penetrated to the highest levels of Imperial command made it clear that the crisis was far more serious than anyone had initially understood. The shocking discovery that challenged fundamental beliefs was the revelation that the corruption had been spread through the very ceremonies and rituals that were supposed to strengthen Imperial unity. The warrior lodges that had been established as social organizations had become focal points for the transmission of chaos influence, their rituals serving as conduits for spiritual corruption that bypassed the rational defenses of the Imperial truth. The bonds of brotherhood that had been celebrated as the foundation of Space Marine effectiveness had been perverted into instruments of damnation. The full scale of deception revealed through the betrayal included the realization that the rebellion had been planned for decades, with seemingly loyal Imperial servants working systematically to undermine the very system they claimed to serve. The corruption had not been a sudden transformation but a gradual process of spiritual decay that had been carefully orchestrated by entities that possessed knowledge of human psychology and the weaknesses of Imperial ideology. The betrayal was not just a military rebellion but a cosmic conspiracy that had been building since the very beginning of the Great Crusade. The compromised sources of Imperial strength included the very qualities that had made the Space Marines so effective as instruments of Imperial will: their absolute loyalty, their willingness to sacrifice themselves for the greater good, their bonds of brotherhood that transcended normal human relationships. All of these virtues had been turned into instruments of corruption. The realization that the Emperor's greatest achievements had become the instruments of his destruction was perhaps the most bitter aspect of the entire betrayal. The moment when the facade collapsed was marked by the virus bombing of Isstvan III, when the true nature of the rebellion was revealed to the galaxy. The systematic murder of loyalist Space Marines by their former brothers demonstrated the complete transformation of the traitor legions and the impossibility of reconciliation. The event marked the point of no return, when the civil war that had been building for decades finally erupted into open conflict that would consume the galaxy. The scale of deception that became apparent through the betrayal included the realization that the corruption had been spread through the very institutions that were supposed to protect the Imperium from such threats. The chaplains who were responsible for maintaining spiritual discipline within the legions had been among the first to fall to corruption, their knowledge of imperial doctrine making them particularly effective agents of subversion. The betrayal was not just a failure of loyalty, but a systematic perversion of the very mechanisms that were supposed to prevent such failures. The revelation of deliberate deception was perhaps the most devastating aspect of the betrayal, as it became clear that the corruption had not been accidental but had been carefully orchestrated by entities that possessed detailed knowledge of imperial weaknesses and vulnerabilities. The Chaos Gods had been patient, allowing the Great Crusade to succeed precisely because each victory brought humanity closer to the precipice from which there could be no return. The betrayal was not just a rebellion but the culmination of a cosmic conspiracy that had been building for millennia. The Great Betrayal thus represented not just a military defeat, but a fundamental crisis of imperial civilization itself. The ideology that had made the Great Crusade possible had also made it impossible for imperial authorities to recognize the true nature of the threat they faced. The corruption of Horus was not just the fall of a single individual, but the beginning of a transformation that would reshape the entire galaxy, turning humanity's greatest dream into its darkest nightmare. The breakdown of imperial command structure following the revelation of the heresy's true scope created a crisis of authority that paralyzed the Imperium's ability to respond effectively to the growing threat. The careful hierarchies and chains of command that had been developed over 2 centuries of continuous expansion suddenly became liabilities when it became unclear who could be trusted and who might be secretly working for the enemy. The very efficiency of the imperial system, which had been one of its greatest strengths during the Great Crusade, became a vulnerability when that efficiency could be turned against the Imperium itself. The infrastructure breakdown that followed the initial betrayals was systematic and devastating, as the traitor forces deliberately targeted the communications networks, supply lines, and administrative centers that were essential to imperial unity. The astropathic relay stations that had enabled near-instantaneous communication across the galaxy were systematically destroyed or corrupted, leaving loyalist forces isolated and unable to coordinate their responses. The loss of these communication networks was perhaps even more devastating than the loss of military assets, as it prevented the Imperium from functioning as a unified entity. The system failures that cascaded through the imperial war machine were not accidental but represented the deliberate exploitation of vulnerabilities that had been carefully studied and cataloged by the traitor forces. The logistics networks that had been designed to supply the advancing legions during the Great Crusade were turned into instruments of sabotage and destruction, with supply convoys being ambushed and vital resources being diverted to serve the traitor cause. The very complexity of the imperial system, which had been necessary to govern a galaxy-spanning empire, became a source of weakness when that complexity could be exploited by enemies who understood its inner workings. The retreat from key positions across the galaxy was forced upon loyalist forces by the sheer scope of the betrayal and the speed with which the traitors had moved to consolidate their gains. The strategic strongholds that had been established during the Great Crusade to serve as bases for further expansion suddenly became isolated outposts that could be surrounded and destroyed by superior enemy forces. The careful positioning of imperial assets that had been designed to support offensive operations became a liability when those assets became targets for enemy attack. The unity of the Imperium dissolving into factions was perhaps the most devastating aspect of the collapse, as the bonds of loyalty and shared purpose that had held the galaxy-spanning empire together were systematically undermined by the revelation of the betrayal. The various institutions of imperial government, from the Council of Terra to the local planetary administrations, found themselves questioning the loyalty of their colleagues and subordinates. The paranoia and suspicion that resulted from this breakdown of trust was perhaps even more destructive than the direct military attacks launched by the traitor forces. The final desperate attempts to maintain imperial authority were characterized by increasingly harsh measures that often proved counterproductive, as the loyalist forces struggled to maintain control over populations that were beginning to question the competence and legitimacy of imperial rule. The imposition of martial law and the suspension of civil liberties, while understandable as emergency measures, actually made the situation worse by creating resentment and resistance among populations that had previously been loyal to the imperial cause. The very measures that were intended to strengthen imperial authority instead weakened it by undermining the trust and cooperation that had been the foundation of imperial success. The effects that made the situation exponentially worse included the realization that the traitor forces possessed detailed knowledge of Imperial weaknesses and vulnerabilities that could only have been acquired through years of careful observation and planning. The precision with which the traitors struck at vital Imperial assets suggested that the rebellion had been planned for decades, with seemingly loyal Imperial servants working systematically to gather intelligence and position themselves for the moment when the betrayal would be revealed. The scope of this intelligence-gathering operation was perhaps even more frightening than the military capabilities of the traitor forces. The rapid loss of long-held Imperial positions was facilitated by the fact that many of these positions had been deliberately weakened through sabotage and subversion that had been carried out over extended periods. The fortress worlds that had been established to serve as strongholds for Imperial forces were found to have been compromised by traitor agents who had been working for years to undermine their defenses. The discovery that these supposedly secure positions had been turned into traps for loyalist forces was perhaps the most demoralizing aspect of the entire collapse. The fate-determining choice that faced the survivors of the initial betrayals was whether to continue fighting a war that seemed increasingly hopeless or to seek some form of accommodation with the traitor forces. The realization that the enemy possessed overwhelming advantages in terms of numbers, positioning, and intelligence created a crisis of morale that was perhaps even more dangerous than the direct military threat. The decision to continue the fight despite the apparent hopelessness of the situation required a level of faith and determination that few possessed. The exponential worsening of the situation was accelerated by the fact that each defeat created conditions that made subsequent defeats more likely. The loss of strategic assets reduced the ability of loyalist forces to defend their remaining positions, while the loss of communication networks made it impossible to coordinate effective responses to enemy attacks. The cascading nature of the collapse meant that even minor setbacks could have catastrophic consequences for the overall Imperial position. The rapid succession of defeats that characterized this period was not accidental but represented the deliberate exploitation of the momentum that the traitors had gained through their initial successes. The psychological impact of continuous defeats was perhaps even more devastating than the material losses, as it created a sense of inevitability about the outcome that undermined the will to resist. The traitor forces understood that the war would be won or lost in the minds of the combatants as much as on the battlefield. The loss of long-held positions that had been considered impregnable was particularly demoralizing to loyalist forces, as it demonstrated that no position was truly secure and that the enemy possessed capabilities that had been previously unsuspected. The fall of fortress worlds that had been established specifically to serve as strongholds for Imperial forces revealed the extent to which the traitor forces had been able to infiltrate and undermine supposedly secure positions. The realization that nowhere was safe created a climate of fear and uncertainty that was corrosive to military effectiveness. The survivors who faced the fate-determining choice of whether to continue fighting or seek accommodation with the traitors were forced to confront the reality that the war had fundamentally changed the nature of the conflict. The ideological certainties that had sustained Imperial forces during the Great Crusade were no longer adequate to address the spiritual and psychological challenges posed by the traitor forces. The decision to continue fighting required not just military courage, but a form of faith that transcended rational calculation. The multiple systems failing simultaneously created a situation where the normal mechanisms of Imperial governance and military command were simply unable to function effectively. The complexity of the Imperial system, which had been necessary to govern a galaxy-spanning empire, became a source of vulnerability when that complexity could be exploited by enemies who understood its inner workings. The cascading failures that resulted from these systematic attacks created a crisis that was beyond the ability of any single individual or institution to address. The attempts to maintain control that failed despite desperate efforts revealed the extent to which the Imperial system had been compromised by the betrayal. The very mechanisms that were supposed to protect the Imperium from internal threats had been turned into instruments of subversion and destruction. The realization that the enemy was not just attacking the Imperium from outside but was working to destroy it from within created a crisis of confidence that was perhaps even more dangerous than the direct military threat. The point where change became inevitable was marked by the realization that the old Imperial system could not be restored, and that any future Imperial government would have to be fundamentally different from what had existed before. The betrayal had not just damaged the Imperium, but had revealed fundamental flaws in its structure and ideology that could not be addressed through minor reforms or administrative changes. The cascading collapse thus represented not just a military defeat but the end of an era in human history. The build-up to the Siege of Terra represented the convergence of forces that had been set in motion across the galaxy for 7 years of brutal civil war. The traitor fleets that had carved a path of destruction through the Imperium's heartland finally reached the cradle of humanity itself, their hulls bearing the scars of countless battles and their crews hardened by years of warfare that had pushed the boundaries of sanity and endurance. The sight of Horus's flagship, the Vengeful Spirit, emerging from the warp above Terra was a moment that crystallized the full horror of what the galaxy had become. As the Emperor's most beloved son prepared to assault the very world that had given birth to human civilization. The detailed account of the climactic conflict that followed reads like a chronicle of the end of worlds. As the most technologically advanced civilization in the galaxy turned its full destructive power against itself, the orbital bombardment that preceded the ground assault reduced entire continents to ash and glass, while the ancient wonders of Terra were systematically destroyed by weapons that had been designed to conquer alien empires. The Imperial Palace, that vast fortress city that had served as the seat of human government for millennia, became the focal point of a siege that would determine the fate of the species itself. The climactic battle at the Imperial Palace lasted for weeks, with every corridor and chamber becoming a battlefield where the finest warriors humanity had ever produced, fought with a desperation born of absolute necessity. The loyalist defenders, led by the surviving Primarchs and their depleted legions, fought with the knowledge that defeat would mean not just death, but the extinction of everything they had sworn to protect. The traitor forces, driven by the corrupting influence of the Chaos Gods and the promise of ultimate victory, attacked with a ferocity that bordered on madness. The key turning points in the Emperor's final confrontation with Horus were shaped by the tragic realization that the son he had loved above all others was truly lost to the darkness. The Emperor's initial reluctance to use his full power against Horus reflected not weakness, but the desperate hope that some vestige of his beloved son might still exist within the corrupted shell that bore his face. This moment of paternal love, while understandable, nearly cost the Emperor everything as Horus pressed his advantage with the ruthless efficiency that had once made him the perfect Warmaster. The battle that ended the heresy and its immediate aftermath unfolded in the throne room of the Imperial Palace, where father and son met in single combat that would determine the fate of humanity. The Emperor's final realization that Horus was beyond redemption came when he witnessed the Warmaster's complete embrace of the Chaos Gods and his willingness to sacrifice everything human for the promise of godhood. The moment when the Emperor finally unleashed his full power against his corrupted son was perhaps the most tragic in human history, as it marked the death of hope and the beginning of an age of darkness. The detailed account of the climactic conflict reveals the supernatural nature of the final battle, as the Emperor and Horus fought not just with physical weapons, but with powers that transcended the material realm. The throne room became a battleground where the forces of order and chaos clashed with an intensity that threatened to tear apart the fabric of reality itself. The psychic energies unleashed during this confrontation were so immense that they created permanent scars in the warp that continue to influence events 10,000 years later. The key turning points that decided the outcome of the battle were shaped by the intervention of forces beyond the purely military. The Emperor's connection to the warp, which he had kept hidden throughout his reign, finally became apparent as he drew upon powers that rivaled those of the Chaos Gods themselves. The revelation that the Emperor was not merely a supremely advanced human, but something far more fundamental to the nature of reality itself, changed the entire character of the conflict from a civil war to a cosmic struggle between order and chaos. The immediate aftermath of Horus's death was characterized by the sudden collapse of the traitor forces, as the spiritual bonds that had held them together were severed by the destruction of their charismatic leader. The Chaos Gods, deprived of their primary champion, found their influence over the material realm suddenly diminished, though not eliminated. The surviving traitor Primarchs and their legions, faced with the reality of their defeat and the magnitude of their crimes, began the retreat that would eventually lead them into exile in the Eye of Terror. The Emperor's internment in the Golden Throne represented the ultimate sacrifice of the Master of Mankind, as he accepted a form of living death in order to maintain the Astronomicon and prevent the complete collapse of the Imperium. The psychic beacon that had guided Imperial ships through the warp for millennia could only be maintained through the Emperor's continuous presence, requiring him to abandon his physical form and exist as a purely spiritual entity. The irony that the Emperor, who had spent his life fighting against the worship of gods, was forced to become one himself, was not lost on those who understood the true nature of his sacrifice. The final confrontation between the Emperor and Horus was witnessed by only a handful of individuals, but their accounts of the battle have become the foundation of Imperial mythology for the 10 millennia that followed. The moment when the Emperor struck down his beloved son was described by those present as the most terrible sight in human history, as the light of hope died in the Emperor's eyes and was replaced by the grim determination that would characterize the Imperium for the rest of its existence. The climactic moment when Horus's corruption was fully revealed occurred when the Emperor finally saw through the lies and deceptions that had been used to turn his son against him. The realization that the Warmaster had embraced the Chaos Gods not out of desperation or misguided loyalty, but out of a fundamental corruption of his nature was perhaps the most devastating discovery of all. The Emperor's final words to his son, before delivering the blow that would end his existence, were reportedly an expression of grief for what had been lost rather than anger at what had been done. The final moments that would echo through the next 10,000 years were shaped by the Emperor's decision to sacrifice his own humanity in order to preserve the Imperium that he had created. The choice to accept internment in the Golden Throne rather than allow the Astronomicon to fail was made with the full knowledge that it would condemn him to an existence of perpetual suffering. The Emperor's willingness to endure this fate for the sake of humanity became the foundation of the Imperial faith that would emerge in the centuries that followed. The ultimate stakes of the confrontation were understood by both participants to extend far beyond the fate of the Imperium or even humanity itself. The battle represented a fundamental conflict between the forces of order and chaos that had implications for the entire galaxy and beyond. The Emperor's victory, though costly, prevented the complete triumph of the Chaos Gods and preserved the possibility that order might eventually prevail over the forces of destruction and corruption. The critical moment when everything changed was marked by the Emperor's realization that victory against chaos required not just military success but spiritual transformation. The decision to embrace his role as a godlike figure despite his lifelong opposition to such concepts represented a fundamental change in the nature of the Imperium and its relationship to the forces of order and chaos. The Emperor's transformation from a secular leader to a spiritual beacon marked the beginning of the imperial cult that would dominate human civilization for the next 10 millennia. The final battle thus represented not just the end of the Horus Heresy, but the beginning of a new age in human history. The Emperor's sacrifice preserved the Imperium, but at the cost of transforming it into something fundamentally different from what it had been during the Great Crusade. The victory over Horus was complete, but the price of that victory would be paid by every generation of humanity that followed, creating the grim darkness of the far future that defines the Warhammer 40,000 universe. The confusion and disorder that followed the Emperor's internment in the Golden Throne created a power vacuum that threatened to complete the destruction that Horus had begun. The loyalist forces that had survived the siege found themselves leaderless and exhausted, their command structure shattered by 7 years of civil war and the loss of their supreme commander. The various factions within the Imperium, from the Space Marine legions to the Adeptus Mechanicus, suddenly found themselves without clear guidance about how to proceed in a universe that had been fundamentally transformed by the events of the heresy. The struggle to fill the power vacuum left by the Emperor's effective death was complicated by the fact that no single individual possessed the authority, knowledge, or capability to assume his role. The Primarchs who had remained loyal to the Emperor found themselves thrust into positions of responsibility for which they had never been prepared, forced to make decisions about the governance of a galaxy-spanning empire while still processing the trauma of their civil war against their own brothers. The civilian authorities of the Imperium, represented by the Council of Terra, lacked the military expertise necessary to direct the reconstruction effort, while the military commanders lacked the political sophistication required for effective governance. The different groups that tried to cope with the new reality each approached the crisis from their own perspective and priorities, creating a fragmented response that often worked at cross purposes. The surviving Space Marine legions focused on hunting down the remaining traitor forces and purging any elements within their own ranks that might have been compromised by chaos corruption. The Adeptus Mechanicus concentrated on rebuilding the technological infrastructure that had been devastated by the war, while the Imperial Navy worked to restore communication and transportation networks across the galaxy. The unexpected consequences of the Emperor's sacrifice became apparent as the full implications of his internment in the Golden Throne were gradually understood. the psychic beacon that maintained the Astronomicon required not just the Emperor's presence but the daily sacrifice of 1,000 psychers to sustain its operation. This terrible requirement, which had been hidden from all but the highest levels of imperial authority, created a logistical and moral crisis that would define imperial policy for millennia to come. The realization that the Emperor's continued existence depended on the systematic murder of his own subjects was perhaps the most bitter discovery of the entire aftermath period. The new dangers that emerged during the transition period were not limited to the obvious threats posed by the surviving traitor forces. The weakening of the barrier between the material and immaterial realms that had resulted from the massive psychic energies unleashed during the final battle created opportunities for demonic incursion that had not existed before. The warp storms that erupted across the galaxy in the wake of the Emperor's transformation made interstellar travel even more dangerous than it had been during the height of the heresy, isolating entire sectors and leaving them vulnerable to attack. The unexpected new problems that emerged included the realization that the victory over Horus had not eliminated the threat of chaos corruption, but had merely changed its nature. The surviving traitor Primarchs and their legions, driven into exile in the Eye of Terror, began to organize themselves for a long-term campaign of terror and destruction that would plague the Imperium for millennia. The corruption that had been spread through the warrior lodges and other institutions had not been eliminated by military victory, but had gone underground, where it could continue to spread and influence imperial society. The new threats that appeared during the transition period included the emergence of entirely new forms of chaos corruption that had not been seen during the heresy itself. The daemon worlds that began to appear in the Eye of Terror represented a fundamental violation of the natural order that threatened to spread throughout the galaxy if not contained. The mutations and aberrations that began to appear among human populations exposed to chaos influence created new categories of threat that imperial authorities were ill-equipped to address. The consequences that were only beginning to unfold included the long-term psychological and spiritual impact of the Civil War on the survivors. The Space Marines who had fought against their own brothers found themselves struggling with forms of trauma and guilt that their mental conditioning had not prepared them to handle. The civilian populations that had witnessed the horrors of the heresy began to develop new forms of religious faith that were fundamentally different from the imperial truth that had previously guided human civilization. The attempts by different factions to cope with the new reality often created additional problems as competing priorities and philosophies clashed in the absence of clear central authority. The military commanders who advocated for aggressive action against the surviving traitor forces found themselves at odds with civilian authorities who prioritized the reconstruction of damaged worlds and the restoration of normal economic activity. The religious movements that began to emerge in response to the Emperor's sacrifice were viewed with suspicion by those who still adhered to the rational principles of the imperial truth. The emergence of new problems during the transition included the realization that the administrative systems that had been developed during the Great Crusade were inadequate to govern an empire that was under constant threat from internal and external enemies. The decentralized command structure that had been effective during a period of expansion became a liability when coordination and rapid response to threats became essential for survival. The bureaucratic mechanisms that had been designed to integrate conquered populations into the imperial system were ill-suited to the task of maintaining loyalty and preventing corruption in a population that had been exposed to chaos influence. The introduction of new threats during the transition period was accelerated by the fact that the weakening of imperial authority created opportunities for various alien species to reassert themselves in areas that had been under imperial control. The Orc empires that had been suppressed during the Great Crusade began to rebuild their strength, while more exotic threats like the Eldar began to take a more active interest in human affairs. The realization that the galaxy contained numerous threats that had been kept in check only by the overwhelming power of the unified Imperium created a crisis of confidence that was perhaps even more dangerous than the direct military threats. The suggestion that the consequences were only beginning became apparent as the full scope of the changes that had been set in motion by the heresy gradually became clear. The transformation of the Emperor from a secular leader to a godlike figure represented a fundamental shift in the nature of human civilization that would have implications for every aspect of imperial society. The emergence of new forms of religious faith, the development of new institutions to combat chaos corruption, and the creation of new military and administrative structures to govern a galaxy under siege all represented changes that would define the character of the Imperium for millennia to come. The immediate aftermath of the Horus Heresy thus represented not just the end of the Civil War, but the beginning of a new phase in human history. The victory over the traitor forces had been achieved, but the price of that victory had been the transformation of the Imperium into something fundamentally different from what it had been during the Great Crusade. The Emperor's sacrifice had preserved human civilization, but it had also condemned it to an existence of perpetual struggle against forces that threatened not just physical destruction but spiritual corruption. The immediate aftermath was thus both a moment of triumph and the beginning of humanity's darkest age. The technological legacy of the Horus Heresy continued to shape the development of human civilization for millennia. After the last shots of the Civil War had been fired, the knowledge that had been lost during the 7 years of fratricidal conflict represented more than just technical specifications or manufacturing processes. It encompassed entire fields of scientific understanding that had taken centuries to develop and could not be easily replaced. The gene laboratories that had produced the Space Marine legions lay in ruins, their secrets partially lost and their remaining knowledge jealously guarded by the surviving Loyalist forces. The standard template construct systems that had enabled the rapid industrialization of newly compliant worlds were damaged beyond repair, forcing the Imperium to rely on increasingly primitive and inefficient methods of production. The cultural impact of the heresy was perhaps even more profound than its technological consequences, as the very foundations of imperial society were transformed by the realization that the greatest heroes could become the most dangerous enemies. The belief changes that swept through human civilization in the wake of the Emperor's sacrifice were fundamental and irreversible, marking the end of the rational secular worldview that had characterized the Great Crusade and the beginning of a new age of faith and superstition. The imperial truth, which had promised to liberate humanity from the darkness of ignorance and fear, was replaced by a religious orthodoxy that viewed doubt and questioning as pathways to corruption and damnation. The ongoing conflicts created by the events of the heresy established patterns of warfare that would define human civilization for the next 10,000 years. The Great Scouring that followed the siege of Terra was not merely a military campaign to eliminate the remaining traitor forces, but the beginning of a perpetual state of war that would become the defining characteristic of the Imperium. The surviving traitor primarchs and their legions, driven into exile in the Eye of Terror, began to organize themselves for a long-term campaign of terror and destruction that would manifest in the form of Black Crusades, daemon incursions, and cult uprisings that would plague the Imperium for millennia. The hidden survivors and remnants of the traitor forces created a network of sleeper agents and corrupted institutions that would continue to threaten imperial stability long after the formal end of the Civil War. The chaos cults that had been established during the heresy did not disappear with the defeat of Horus, but instead went underground, where they could continue to recruit new members and spread their corrupting influence throughout imperial society. The warrior lodges that had served as vectors for the original corruption were disbanded, but their members scattered throughout the Imperium, carrying with them the knowledge and techniques that could be used to establish new cells of corruption. The technological legacy that proved indestructible was not the advanced systems and weapons that had been developed during the Great Crusade, but the basic principles of genetic engineering and psychic manipulation that had been used to create the Primarchs and the Space Marines. The knowledge of how to create superhuman warriors could not be completely eliminated, and the techniques developed during the heresy for corrupting and controlling such beings would continue to be used by the forces of chaos for millennia to come. The very existence of the Space Marines, with their enhanced genetics and psychic potential, created permanent vulnerabilities that could be exploited by entities that understood the spiritual dimension of reality. The continuing effects that extended beyond initial expectations included the gradual transformation of the Imperium from a dynamic expansionist civilization into a static defensive empire that was primarily concerned with maintaining what it had, rather than achieving new conquests. The administrative structures that had been developed to govern newly conquered worlds were adapted to serve the needs of a society under siege, creating bureaucratic systems that were designed to prevent corruption and maintain loyalty rather than to promote efficiency and innovation. The result was a form of government that was increasingly rigid and authoritarian, where conformity was valued above creativity and tradition was considered more important than progress. The influence that proved indestructible was the fundamental change in human psychology that resulted from the realization that the forces of chaos were real, and that they posed an existential threat to the survival of the species. The paranoia and suspicion that had been necessary survival mechanisms during the heresy became permanent features of imperial culture, creating a society where trust was rare and deviation from orthodoxy was viewed as potentially treasonous. The mental conditioning that had been developed to protect Space Marines from chaos corruption was extended to other segments of imperial society, creating a population that was psychologically prepared for perpetual war, but increasingly incapable of the intellectual flexibility necessary for scientific and cultural advancement. The effects that continued beyond expectations included the gradual deification of the emperor, despite his explicit rejection of such worship during his lifetime. The religious movements that emerged in response to his sacrifice gradually coalesced into a unified imperial cult that would become the dominant force in human civilization for the next 10 millennia. The irony that the emperor, who had spent his life fighting against the worship of gods, was himself elevated to divine status was not lost on those who remembered the original principles of the imperial truth, but their voices were gradually silenced by the overwhelming need for spiritual certainty in a universe that had proven to be far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. The suggestion that the subject might not be finished was supported by the continuing activity of the surviving traitor primarchs and their followers, who remained active in the Eye of Terror and continued to launch periodic attacks against the Imperium. The Black Crusades led by Abaddon the Despoiler represented the most obvious continuation of the original conflict, but they were merely the most visible manifestation of a struggle that continued on multiple levels throughout imperial society. The corruption that had been spread during the heresy had not been eliminated but had adapted to new circumstances, finding new ways to infiltrate and subvert imperial institutions. The indestructible nature of the heresy's influence was demonstrated by the fact that every subsequent crisis in imperial history could be traced back to the fundamental problems that had been exposed during the Civil War. The weakness of the imperial system to spiritual corruption, the tendency of individual leaders to accumulate excessive power, the difficulty of maintaining unity across a galaxy-spanning empire. All of these issues had been present during the Great Crusade, but had been masked by the Emperor's personal authority and the momentum of continuous expansion. The heresy had not created these problems but had revealed them in their full magnitude, and the solutions that had been developed in response had often created new problems that were equally serious. The continuing effects beyond expectations included the gradual decline of human technological capability, as the knowledge lost during the heresy could not be replaced, and the paranoia created by the Civil War made innovation increasingly difficult. The Adeptus Mechanicus, which had been responsible for maintaining and developing imperial technology, became increasingly conservative and ritualistic in its approach to technological problems. The fear that new discoveries might provide opportunities for chaos corruption led to the suppression of scientific research and the elevation of tradition over innovation, creating a technological stagnation that would persist for millennia. The tease that the subject might not be finished was supported by the continuing relevance of the heresy to current events in the 41st millennium. The return of Primarchs like Robout Guilliman suggested that the story of the Emperor's sons was not over, and the increasing activity of Chaos forces indicated that the conflict that had begun 10,000 years earlier was entering a new phase. The Great Rift that had split the galaxy in two was reminiscent of the divisions that had characterized the heresy, and the challenges faced by the current Imperium were fundamentally similar to those that had led to the original Civil War. The long-term consequences of the Horus Heresy thus represented not just the aftermath of a single conflict, but the establishment of patterns and problems that would define human civilization for millennia. The technological losses, cultural changes, ongoing conflicts, and hidden threats that emerged from the Civil War created a legacy that would influence every aspect of imperial society for the next 10,000 years. The heresy had not just damaged the Imperium but had fundamentally transformed it into something that the Emperor himself might not have recognized, creating the grim darkness of the far future that defines the Warhammer 40,000 universe. The modern discoveries about the Horus Heresy and their implications for the current state of the Imperium have taken on new urgency in the wake of recent events that seem to echo the patterns established during humanity's greatest civil war. The return of Robout Guilliman from his millennia-long sleep has provided unprecedented insights into the true nature of the heresy and the Emperor's original intentions, revealing details that had been lost to historical revisionism and deliberate obfuscation. The Primarch's accounts of his father's final days, his conversations with the other loyalist Primarchs, and his understanding of the cosmic forces that had driven the galaxy to war, have fundamentally challenged many of the assumptions that had guided Imperial policy for 10,000 years. The way the subject still affects current events becomes apparent when examining the various crises that have plagued the Imperium in recent centuries, from the opening of the Great Rift to the increasing frequency of chaos incursions across the galaxy. The patterns of corruption and betrayal that characterized the original heresy continue to manifest in new forms, adapted to the changed circumstances of the 41st millennium, but fundamentally unchanged in their essential nature. The chaos cults that operate throughout Imperial space employ the same techniques of gradual infiltration and spiritual corruption that had been perfected during the warrior lodge networks of the 31st millennium, while the Black Crusades launched from the Eye of Terror represent the direct continuation of the original rebellion under new leadership. The significance of the heresy for the galaxy's future becomes increasingly apparent as the Imperium faces challenges that are remarkably similar to those that had precipitated the original Civil War. The strain of governing a galaxy-spanning empire, the difficulty of maintaining unity among diverse human populations, the corruption inherent in concentrating too much power in the hands of individual leaders, all of these problems remain as relevant today as they were 10,000 years ago. The solutions that had been developed in response to the heresy, from the Codex Astartes to the structures of the Adeptus Terra, are themselves being challenged by new circumstances that require forms of flexibility and adaptation that the current imperial system seems incapable of providing. The connections to ongoing narratives in the 41st millennium are becoming increasingly explicit as the galaxy enters what many observers believe to be a new age of conflict that may rival or even exceed the original heresy in its scope and consequences. The return of the Primarchs, the increasing activity of the Chaos Gods, the weakening of the barriers between the material and immaterial realms. All of these developments suggest that the cosmic forces that had driven the original Civil War are once again gathering strength for another attempt to corrupt or destroy human civilization. The modern discoveries that have emerged from archaeological expeditions to sites associated with the heresy have provided new insights into the true nature of the conflict and the forces that had driven it. The recovery of intact data cores from the battlefields of Isstvan, the analysis of weapon fragments that still bear traces of demonic corruption, the examination of space marine remains that show evidence of both genetic enhancement and spiritual transformation. All of these discoveries have contributed to a growing understanding of the heresy that goes far beyond the simplified narratives that had been taught in imperial schools for millennia. The implications of these discoveries for current imperial policy are profound and disturbing, as they suggest that many of the assumptions upon which the current system is based may be fundamentally flawed. The revelation that the Emperor had been aware of the chaos threat from the beginning of the Great Crusade, and had deliberately chosen to conceal this knowledge from his sons, raises questions about the wisdom of the current imperial policy of maintaining similar secrecy about the true nature of the threats facing humanity. The evidence that the corruption of the Primarchs had been facilitated by their isolation from spiritual guidance and their exposure to corrupting influences without proper preparation suggests that the current approach to protecting imperial leaders from chaos corruption may be counterproductive. The way the heresy connects to larger themes in the Warhammer 40,000 universe becomes apparent when considering the cyclical nature of the conflict between order and chaos that seems to define the galaxy's history. The heresy was not an isolated event, but part of a larger pattern of corruption and renewal that has characterized human civilization throughout its existence. The age of strife that had preceded the Great Crusade had been caused by similar forces of spiritual corruption and technological overreach, while the current crisis facing the Imperium seems to be driven by the same fundamental tensions between humanity's desire for progress and the cosmic forces that seek to exploit that ambition for their own purposes. The final thoughts on the cosmic significance of the heresy must acknowledge that the conflict was not merely a civil war between human factions, but a fundamental struggle between the forces of order and chaos that has implications for the entire galaxy and beyond. The Emperor's victory over Horus had prevented the complete triumph of the Chaos Gods, but it had not eliminated the threat they represented. The ongoing struggle between the Imperium and the forces of chaos is thus not just a military conflict, but a spiritual war that will determine the ultimate fate of humanity, and perhaps all sentient life in the galaxy. The suggestion that the story may not be over is supported by the increasing evidence that the cosmic forces that had driven the original heresy are once again gathering strength for another attempt to corrupt or destroy human civilization. The return of the Primarchs, the opening of the Great Rift, the increasing frequency of demonic incursions, all of these developments suggest that the galaxy may be entering a new phase of the eternal conflict between order and chaos. The question that remains is whether humanity has learned enough from the lessons of the heresy to survive this new crisis, or whether the species is doomed to repeat the same mistakes that had nearly destroyed it 10,000 years ago. The implications that are both hopeful and terrifying for humanity's future stem from the realization that the heresy had not been an inevitable catastrophe, but the result of specific choices and circumstances that could potentially be avoided in the future. The knowledge that has been gained from studying the original Civil War provides insights that could be used to prevent similar tragedies, but it also reveals the magnitude of the challenges that humanity faces in its ongoing struggle against the forces of corruption and decay. The hope lies in the possibility that the lessons of the past can be applied to the challenges of the present, while the terror comes from the realization that the forces that seek humanity's destruction are patient, intelligent, and possessed of resources that transcend the material realm. In the grim darkness of the far future, the Horus Heresy remains humanity's greatest triumph and its ultimate tragedy. The civil war that began with a single son's betrayal continues to shape every aspect of the Imperium, from the Emperor's eternal vigil on the Golden Throne to the Space Marines who still bear the genetic legacy of their corrupted brothers. The heresy's legacy serves as both a warning and a guide, reminding humanity of the price of hubris while providing the knowledge necessary to face the challenges that lie ahead. The question that haunts the current millennium is whether the species has the wisdom to learn from its greatest failure, or whether it is doomed to repeat the same mistakes in an endless cycle of corruption and renewal. The story of the Horus Heresy thus stands as the defining moment in human history, a tragedy of cosmic proportions that transformed a species on the verge of transcendence into a civilization barely surviving in a universe that seeks its destruction. Yet within that tragedy lies the seed of hope, for the very fact that humanity survived its greatest crisis suggests that it possesses the strength and resilience necessary to face whatever challenges the future may bring. The heresy's legacy is thus not just one of loss and suffering but of endurance and determination, a testament to the human spirit's capacity to endure even the darkest of times and emerge, if not unchanged then at least unbroken. In the end, the Horus Heresy remains what it has always been, humanity's greatest story told in the language of war and sacrifice, of love and betrayal, of dreams destroyed and faith reborn in the crucible of cosmic conflict.